My phone woke me at 4 in the morning. Not the gentle buzz of a text or the soft alarm I'd set. A call, an actual phone call at 4 in the morning is never good news. I remember my hand shaking as I reached for it on the nightstand. The screen lit up my face in the dark and I saw St. Paul's Hospital across the caller ID. My heart did something strange in my chest, a skip followed by a hard thud. I knew what hospital's calling at 4 in the morning meant. I'd lived that particular nightmare once before, and I never wanted to experience it again. But here it was, happening again, and I forced myself to answer before it went to voicemail, before I could talk myself out of hearing whatever came next. This is Dr. Sarah Chen calling from St. Paul's Hospital Neurology Department. I'm calling about your brother, David Marcus. Is this the right time to talk? I'd been through this kind of call before. That careful preamble was never a good sign. I sat up in bed, my mouth already dry. Yes, this is fine. What happened? Nothing bad, actually. That's why I'm calling. There's been an unexpected development in his condition, and we need you to come in. There was something in her voice, a strange note that I couldn't quite identify. Not alarm, not excitement, but something close to the latter. It had been 19 years since David's accident. 19 years of his body lying in a hospital bed, of machines breathing for him, of ventilators and feeding tubes and catheters, and the relentless beeping of cardiac monitors, tracking a heart that kept beating, even though the person inhabiting that heart had gone somewhere we could. 19 years of me visiting mostly every Sunday, sometimes more often, sometimes less, talking to his unconscious face about nothing of consequence, telling him about my week, my problems, my loneliness, as if he could hear me, as if any of it mattered to someone who existed in complete darkness. And now this doctor was calling at 4 in the morning with news that required me to come in. That couldn't mean anything good. What happened? I asked again. I need you to brace yourself for this. Your brother has regained consciousness. He's awake. My mouth went dry. There was a silence where I should have responded where a normal person would have responded, but I couldn't. The words didn't pass. Awake. The word didn't fit into any rational context. It had been 19 years. 19 years of stasis. 19 years of that hospital room with the beige walls and the machines in his body, somehow both aging and frozen, suspended in time, awake. I'm sorry, I'm probably not explaining this clearly, Dr. Chen continued. There was nervousness in her voice now. David opened his eyes approximately 30 minutes ago. His pupils are responsive. He's tracking movement with both eyes. He attempted to speak, though the ventilator is preventing full speech. His EEG shows activity that we haven't seen in years. I need you to come to the hospital now. We need to start running a series of tests to understand what's happening. But before we do that, we need to speak with you about his medical history and his advanced care directives. That's when it hit me like a physical blow. Oh, the papers coming back into my mind. I'd signed the papers just 10 days ago. 10 days! It had been 10 days since I'd finally, after years of agonizing conversations with the palliative care team, with myself in the dark hours when sleep wouldn't come and I'd sit on my apartment balcony smoking cigarettes that I'd promised myself I quit in 2015, made the most difficult decision of my life. Quality of life, the palliative team had said in that careful, compassionate way they have. Look at his condition. He shows no meaningful signs of improvement. His brain function in the cortical regions remains minimal. There's no evidence of awareness. No evidence that he experiences his environment or his existence in any meaningful way. He has no quality of life, and you're not honouring his memory by keeping him on these machines indefinitely. So I'd signed the papers, advanced directives, DNR, let natural death occur. If his heart stopped, we would not resuscitate. If he had another infection that his antibiotics couldn't fight, we would not intervene with aggressive treatment. If his lungs failed again, we would not intubate. We would let him go. We would finally let him rest. And now, just 10 days later, his heart was beating on its own, and his eyes were open, and he was attempting to speak. But I'm getting ahead of myself here. I'm standing in my bedroom in the dark, phone pressed to my ear, and a neurologist is telling me something that cannot possibly be true. I need to back up, to explain how we actually got to this moment, to walk you through the 19 years that led to me signing papers to end my brother's life just 10 days ago. Let me start at the beginning, at the moment when everything changed in what felt like a single, catastrophic instant. Though, of course, these things never happen quite that way. They build and accumulate and layer on top of each other, and then one day, on a beautiful Saturday afternoon in September, the world simply shatters and nothing is ever the same again. I'm 57 years old now. I work as a project manager for a large construction firm downtown, handling mid-rise residential and commercial projects. It's not glamorous work, but it's steady, and at my age, steady matters. Before David's accident, I was different in almost every way. I worked in finance, had a better salary, wore different kinds of suits. I lived what I thought was a normal middle-class life with all the normal middle-class problems you're supposed to have. A mortgage payment, car loans, the usual anxieties about money and time and whether you're doing enough to secure your future. I had a wife named Catherine, and we'd been married for 17 years before the accident. We had a daughter named Sophie, who's now 24. She's alive and well somewhere in the world. But she hasn't spoken to me in 3 years. That's a separate story, though, and I'll get to it. What matters for now is understanding who I was before and what David meant to me. David was my brother, 5 years younger. He was vibrant, genuinely. I don't say that as some kind of romantic platitude about a coma patient. I mean, he was the kind of person who made other people feel more alive just by being around him. He taught high school physics, and he was the teacher that students remembered years later, the one they'd cite when they decided to pursue science. He wasn't just good at explaining concepts. He made it matter. He went hiking on weekends, climbed mountains, competed in races. He'd finished a marathon about 6 months before his accident. He sent me a photo of himself at the finish line, covered in sweat, grinning in a way that made it clear he'd never been happier. He'd just gotten engaged to a woman named Lisa, smart, kind woman who worked in non-profit administration. They were planning a full wedding. He called me on a Tuesday in August, about 3 weeks before it happened. I remember I was at work at my desk in the finance office, and he was so excited he could barely get the words out. He wanted me to be his best man. He asked me like he wasn't sure I'd say yes, like maybe I'd be too busy or too important or something. I said yes before he even finished the sentence. But we weren't always close, David and I. That's important to understand. There was a period, about 10 years, where we barely saw each other, barely spoke. We were too different, I think. He was the adventurer, the risk-taker, the one willing to chase whatever seemed exciting. I was the careful one, the planner, the one who believed in following the rules and doing things the approved way. Our parents were still alive then, though they're gone now, and I think, if I'm honest, I was always more their favourite, the safe bet, the reliable one. David was the one who made them worry with his climbing expeditions and his spontaneous road trips. But then, starting about 5 years before his accident, we started rebuilding things. I don't know exactly what changed. Maybe I got tired of the resentment. Maybe David did. We started texting, making plans, having beers together after work. He and Lisa would come to our house for dinner sometimes. Catherine and Sophie got to know him better. We were becoming something like real friends, not just brothers bound by blood and shared childhood. We were actually choosing to be close, and that's what makes what happened next so much harder. Because when the accident happened, I didn't just lose my brother, I lost the brother I'd finally rediscovered. I lost years of dinners and conversations and getting to know him as an adult. I lost the possibility of standing up at his wedding and making a speech about how we'd found our way back to each other. I lost all of that in a single moment, and that's something you really can't understand until you're living inside it. 19 years ago, in September, David was rock climbing in the Cascades, the mountains about 2 hours northeast of the city, near a place called Chiacamas Canyon. It was a weekend trip with 4 of his friends from the climbing gym and Lisa. They were going to tackle a route that David had completed before, something rated moderately challenging but within his skill level. He'd been climbing for about 8 years at that point. He was experienced, knew all the safety protocols, always double-checked his rope work before ascending. He wasn't reckless. I need to be clear about that. He wasn't the kind of climber who took unnecessary risks or ignored safety. The weather was perfect. Saturday in September, sunny and warm with excellent visibility. The rock was dry. Perfect climbing conditions. Perfect in every way, right up until the moment when perfect stopped mattering. What happened, according to the friends who were there, is this. David had completed the climb and was rappelling back down. He was secured to the rope with proper anchoring equipment. Everything was done correctly, the way he'd done it dozens of times before. But on the descent, about 6 or 7 meters above the ground, the rope snagged on a sharp rock edge at the outcropping. When David pulled to release it, there was a sudden shift in the rope's position. Or maybe the anchor point gave way and David started to fall. The rope held his legs, so his body twisted as gravity took him. His head came down hard against a rock protrusion on the way down. His friend said he was unconscious before he actually impacted the ground. They said there was a lot of blood. One of them immediately called for emergency services. The others applied pressure to the head wound and tried to keep him stable until the paramedics arrived by helicopter, which took about 40 minutes. Meanwhile, I was at work 19 floors up in the finance building downtown, sitting at my desk on a Thursday afternoon in September. I was working on a quarterly report, entering numbers into spreadsheets, the kind of work you do without really thinking about it. My phone rang. Unknown number. I almost didn't answer it. If I hadn't answered, if I'd let it go to voicemail, the next 10 minutes of my life would have been different. But I answered. This is St. Paul's Hospital calling for a David Marcus. Are you a family member? Yes. I'm his brother. Is he okay? There was a pause, the kind of pause that tells you everything before the words come. I'm going to connect you with a member of the nursing staff. There's been an accident. I don't remember the drive to the hospital. I must have driven there, but there's no memory of it. No memory of getting up from my desk, grabbing my jacket, telling someone I was leaving, walking to the parking garage. I have a vague image of the concrete structure, the harsh fluorescent lighting, but it's like remembering a dream. The next clear memory I have is Catherine arriving in the waiting room. I don't know how she knew to come or who called her. A neurosurgeon came out from the back, still wearing his surgical mask around his neck, and started explaining things in terms I could solely understand. Severe traumatic brain injury, diffuse axonal injury, significant intracranial bleeding, brain swelling. They needed to go in surgically and evacuate the hematoma, reduce the pressure on his brain tissue. They were recommending a medically induced coma to give his brain time to recover. To heal, they hoped. The technical terminology washed over me like water. What I understood, stripped to its essential meaning, was they were putting my brother in a coma. Maybe he would wake up. Maybe he wouldn't. If he did, he might be okay. He might not be. Nobody could say, uncertain. That was the word that stuck in my mind and wouldn't dislodge. Uncertain. Not hopeful, though the surgeon used that word. Not optimistic. Uncertain. That's what severe brain injuries are. You can't predict. T outcomes. You can intervene medically, you can manage the bleeding and the swelling, but you can't know who comes out the other side of it or what they're like when they do. Lisa was in the waiting room. I held her while she cried. Catherine sat nearby looking pale. We waited through surgery. 4 hours and 40 minutes. I don't know what we talked about. Nothing important. The surgery concluded. The neurosurgeon came back with better news than the initial prognosis. He'd successfully evacuated the hematoma. He'd reduced the intracranial pressure. The swelling was significant but manageable. Now they would wait and see. They would keep David in a medically induced coma for a week, perhaps 2, while his brain settled down and the swelling decreased. After that period, they would graduate. Lee reduced the sedation and see if he would wake up. They would assess his neurological status then. They couldn't make promises. Brain injuries were inherently unpredictable. But there was reason to hope. That's exactly what the surgeon said. Reason to hope. I would hold on to those words for a very long time. The first year after David's accident was the longest year of my life. I would understand people who say that now, but at the time, I didn't comprehend how much a year could stretch when it was filled with hospital visits, with conversations with neurologists and brain specialists, with the watching and waiting of recovery that never came, with hope that gradually calcified into something harder and less hopeful with each passing week. He woke up after 2 weeks in the medical coma. His eyes opened. He was extubated, the breathing tube removed, and for about 36 hours I thought he was coming back. I really did. His eyes tracked light when they held a pen light in front of his face. They said he might be aware of his surroundings. The neurologist was cautiously optimistic. We all were. We started planning. We made lists of rehabilitation facilities. We talked about what his recovery might look like. But then a seizure happened, a massive one, and they had to re-intubate him. And something inside David seemed to retreat further. When they brought him back from that event, he never tracked movement again the same way. His eyes were open, but there was no one behind them. That's the only way I can describe it. No one was home. The lights were on, but nobody was answering. The doctors called it minimal consciousness, possibly a vegetative state, though they qualified that because he did respond to certain stimuli in unpredictable ways. He would sometimes grimace when they moved his limbs. Sometimes his heart rate would spike at loud noises. But there was no evidence of true awareness, no indication that he experienced or understood anything. There was no evidence that the person I knew as David still existed inside that body. His engagement with Lisa ended 3 months after the accident. I don't blame her, even though part of me wanted to at the time. She visited for those first few months, and I could see her dying a little more each time she walked into his hospital room. She'd talk to him, hold his hand, sit on the edge of the bed and cry on his shoulder, which was impossible because he was lying down and couldn't support her weight or offer her any comfort in return. Eventually she stopped coming. She sent a letter through a mutual friend explaining that she loved him, but couldn't spend her whole life mourning someone who was still technically alive. I understood that then, though I also resented her for being able to walk away. Lisa went on to have a life. She got married to someone else 5 years after David's accident, and I sometimes see her around the city, and she looks happy and seems at peace, and I'm genuinely glad for her. But I also hate her a little for not staying, which is probably unfair. The first year was when everyone came by to visit. Friends, colleagues, distant relatives who wanted to do the right thing. The hospital room overflowed with flowers and cards. People sat in the waiting room telling me that David was in their thoughts and prayers. After the first few months, though, the visits thinned out. That's natural. People have their own lives. You can't expect people to hold vigil forever. But my father could, and my mother could, and I could. We fell into a rhythm. My dad would visit on Tuesdays, my mother on Thursdays, I would go on Sundays, and Catherine would sometimes come on Fridays. We'd sit in that room with the machines beeping and the IV lines running and the feeding tube and the catheter, and we'd talk to David about nothing important. I'd tell him about Sophie's soccer games, about Catherine's job, about my work. My mother would read him poetry, old poems she'd loved when she was young. My father would sit quietly, sometimes holding David's hand. We did this every week for 10 years without anything changing. The machines beeped the same rhythm. His eyes looked the same. His body slowly atrophied from disuse, muscles weakening and tightening, but his face didn't age the way the rest of us did. It was like he was frozen in time while the rest of the world moved forward. During those second 10 years, things fell apart. That's the only way to describe it. My parents aged rapidly. My mother developed Alzheimer's. My father became her full-time caregiver and stopped visiting as often. Eventually, he stopped visiting at all. By the time I was in my middle 50s, I was the only one going regularly. Catherine and I had been growing apart for years, and by year 12, she asked me for a divorce. She was tired, she said. Tired of feeling like she was married to a ghost. Tired of competing with David's accident for my attention. She wasn't entirely wrong. My marriage was a casualty of David's coma, though Catherine would probably say that's too dramatic. She'd say she just realised she wanted more from life than what we had become. She was right about that too. Sophie took it hard. She was 14 when her parents separated, and she blamed me for not being present enough during her childhood because I was always at the hospital. She was probably right about that as well. That's when I started drinking, I think. Not heavily, not enough that anyone would call me an alcoholic, but enough that I was having a glass of wine or 2 or 3 most nights when I came home from the hospital. I started going to less frequently, not because I wanted to, but because it hurt less when I didn't go. The pain of seeing David unchanged year after year, it was becoming unbearable. I was aging, I was getting tired, I was running out of hope that things would ever change, and I was starting to feel guilty for wanting them to end. Is that terrible? I think it probably is, but it's true. By year 15, they had to remove David's feeding tube and use a different method, percutaneous endoscopic gastrostomy, a PEG tube, because he was having trouble with aspiration. By year 17, he had a significant contracture on his left side. His muscles had tightened from disuse until his limbs were frozen in fixed positions. His kidneys were showing signs of chronic problems. His lungs were prone to infections, and I realised sitting in that hospital room during a particularly bad respiratory infection, when they were considering ventilator support again, that this wasn't life. It was biological persistence. It was cells dividing and hearts beating and lungs breathing, but it wasn't a life. David was never going to recover. The doctors had stopped saying he might recover somewhere around year 7. But I kept hoping anyway, kept visiting, kept talking to him about nothing. kept pretending that some part of him could hear me. Then I stopped pretending. The last few weeks before I signed the papers were the most difficult of the entire 19 years. His condition had declined significantly. He'd had 3 hospitalizations in the past year alone. His kidneys were failing. His liver function was decreasing steadily. His latest infection, pneumonia, had been resistant to antibiotics. The palliative care team sat down with me in a small beige consultation room and said the words I'd been dreading, and also, if I'm being honest, hoping to hear. "It's time to think about what David would want if he was able to tell us," they said carefully. "What quality of life does he have? What are we prolonging? Is it compassionate to continue aggressive treatment, or is it more compassionate to let him go?" I didn't know. I genuinely didn't know. For Ninetham's in years, I had told myself that keeping him alive was the right choice. The hope was worth something, that the chance, however infinitesimal, that he might somehow recover or improve was reason enough to continue fighting. But hope is a heavy thing to carry for 19 years. It begins to feel less like hope and more like burden. More like punishment, more like an obligation I'd imposed on myself and on my brother. I met with his medical team multiple times. I met with a counsellor. I sat in my apartment for 3 days straight without going to work and thought about what David would want. My little brother who loved climbing mountains and running marathons and being alive, really alive, in the world. Who wanted to marry Lisa and teach physics to eager students and explore and experience. And I decided that if he was aware somewhere inside that immobilized body, trapped in that frozen form, he would be horrified at what his life had become. He would want peace. He would want rest. I signed the papers on a Thursday afternoon. Advanced directives that said if his heart stopped, or if he had another serious infection, we would not resuscitate. We would not intervene with aggressive treatment. We would let him rest. I cried after I signed them. Then I went to work and pretended nothing had happened. 10 days later, at 4 a.m, the doctor called and told me he was awake. I couldn't find words. My mouth was open, but nothing came out. My hand went numb holding the phone, the little rectangle of plastic and glass suddenly weighing about 1,000 pounds. Dr. Chen was still talking, explaining something about preliminary scans they'd already run and how they wanted to begin cognitive assessments as soon as possible. But her voice sounded like it was coming from underwater, distorted and distant and somehow not real. Awake. The word kept bouncing around in my skull like something broken, something that had been shattered and was rattling in pieces. Awake. 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 I kept replaying the moment 3 days ago, a Thursday afternoon, grey and cold like all the other afternoons, when I'd sat in the palliative care office on the 3rd floor of this exact same spittle, in one of those small beige consultation rooms with the boxes of tissues positioned strategically on every surface, like they knew we were coming to cry, and I'd signed my name on papers that said my brother could die. Not that I wanted him to die. That's not what I'm saying at all. That's not the thought I'm trying to express. But if his heart stopped beating, if his body gave up on maintaining life, if his kidneys failed completely, or if another infection came that the antibiotics couldn't possibly touch, that would be okay. We would not force his body to keep going. We would not intervene. We would not resuscitate. We would allow him to rest. The papers had specific language. I remember reading it carefully, trying to make sure I understood what I was consenting to. Let natural death occur. That phrase kept repeating. Let natural death occur. As if death was something that needed permission to happen. As if I was allowing something rather than preventing something else. I'd signed those papers knowing I was choosing to let him go. I'd made peace with it. Or I'd told myself I had made peace with it, which amounts to the same thing if you tell yourself something enough times. I'd convinced myself that 19 years was enough, that I'd done my duty, that he'd lived long enough in this state that extending it further wasn't mercy, it was cruelty, that this was kindness. I'd signed those papers with the palliative care team watching me with their compassionate expressions and their careful words about quality of life and meaningful existence. I'd gone back to work, hat afternoon, and sat at my desk and looked at the same computer screen I'd been staring at for weeks, and I'd told myself it was the right decision, the kind decision, the only merciful decision left to make. And now, 3 days later, at 4 a.m, this doctor was telling me that he was awake, that he was conscious, that the ending I'd written had somehow been erased. But Dr. Chen was asking me if I was still there. I told her I was. I was very much there, frozen in my bedroom in the dark, my body rigid under the covers, listening to her explain something that couldn't possibly be true. I asked her to repeat it. She did, speaking more slowly this time, as if the problem was that I hadn't understood the words rather than that I understood them perfectly but they made no sense. David had regained consciousness approximately 2 hours ago. His vitals had been stable before the call came in. They were running a preliminary neurological exam now. They were amazed, she said. Honestly amazed. This wasn't supposed to happen. His EEG was showing activity in the frontal lobe. His brainstem responses were intact. His pupils were reactive. His eyes were tracking, she strongly urged me to come to the hospital. We need to begin assessment immediately, she said. There's so much we need to understand about what's happened. There's so much that doesn't make sense. I remember nodding as if she could see me through the phone. I remember saying, okay, I'll come in. I remember asking her the questions that seemed to matter, if he was going to be himself, if he could think, if he could hear me, could he speak. She said she didn't know yet. Way too early to make any predictions. These things took time and rest and rehabilitation. But he was awake, and he was stable, and that was dramatically more than they'd had any reason to expect given his condition. Wouldn't I want to come see him? Of course I wanted to. That's what I said, of course. Come immediately, but inside, my head, something was screaming. I hung up the phone and I sat in the dark for what might have been 15 minutes or might have been an hour. I couldn't track time. My brain wasn't processing the sequence correctly. The papers I'd signed had been the ending, final act, conclusion. Mercy killing. Not mercy killing, but letting him go, allowing him to rest, stopping the intervention and accepting the inevitable. That was supposed to be the ending. The hospital had called me 3 days ago to tell me he was deteriorating rapidly, that his kidneys were failing, that another infection was establishing itself, that we needed to discuss what we wanted to do. And we had discussed it, the medical team and I, in that consultation room on the 3rd floor, and we had decided together that we would stop intervening, that we would stop fighting the inevitable, that we would let him go. And now, 3 days later, 72 hours later, he was awake. And that meant the ending I'd chosen wasn't actually the ending anymore. That meant the decision I'd made had somehow been rendered obsolete by biology. I thought about calling Catherine, then remembered we hadn't spoken in 2 years except through lawyers and email. I thought about calling Sophie, then remembered she hated me and blamed me for her fractured childhood. I thought about calling my therapist, then realised it was 4 a.m, and even the universe didn't deserve that level of chaos. I didn't have anyone to call. So I got out of bed in the dark. My legs felt shaky. I pulled on clothes without turning on the light, just grabbing things from the chair where I'd left them the day before, jeans and a shirt that might have been clean, I couldn't tell. I stumbled around finding my keys and my wallet. I got in my car and I drove to the hospital in the middle of the night like I'd done 1,000 times before, like this was normal. Like I wasn't driving towards something that was going to destroy the fragile equilibrium I'd finally established in my own mind. The parking garage was nearly empty at that hour. It was 4:45 in the morning, and the city was still asleep, and I was one of maybe 3 cars driving through that fluorescent-lit concrete structure, my tyres echoing and re-echoing off the concrete walls, the sound multiplying in the empty space, heading toward a truth I couldn't comprehend. I kept my hands tight on the steering wheel, my knuckles white from gripping. I kept my breathing shallow, almost like I was trying to take up less space, like if I breathed quietly enough, maybe the universe wouldn't notice I was there. I told myself not to panic, that this wasn't necessarily bad. That awake was better than comatose, obviously, objectively, logically. That consciousness was something we could work with, that they could teach him, and to talk again, to think again, to be himself again, maybe. That this was a miracle, wasn't it? That's what everyone would call it. A miracle. A spontaneous neurological recovery after 19 years of stasis. A medical impossibility that somehow happened. A miracle. But it didn't feel like a miracle sitting alone in my car at 4:45 in the morning. It felt like a mistake, a complication, a rupture in the plan I'd finally, after so many years of agonizing uncertainty, accepted. It felt like the universe had decided to upend everything I'd decided in order to feel less guilty. I found a parking spot near the elevator. I walked through the hospital corridors that I could have navigated in my sleep, blindfolded after 19 years of repetition, neurology, 4th floor, past the waiting room, past the nurse's station. Down the hallway I'd walked down hundreds, maybe thousands of times. The same beige walls, the same terrible fluorescent lights that made everything look sick, the same smell of antiseptic and something underneath it, something organic and damaged and wrong. I'd spent so much of my life in these corridors, 19 years of my life spent here, and somehow it still felt shocking every time, like it shouldn't still be a surprise, like I should have gotten used to this by now. Dr. Chen was waiting for me outside David's room when I got there. She was younger than I'd expected, maybe mid-40s, with dark hair pulled back in a tight ponytail, wearing navy scrubs that had a coffee stain near the pocket, and holding a tablet that seemed to contain all of the mysteries of the universe. She looked like she hadn't slept in about 30 hours. There were dark circles under her eyes, and a tension around her mouth that suggested she'd been dealing with medical impossibilities all night. She had that look that doctors get when something violates everything they thought they knew about how the human body works. She pulled me aside before we went in, leading me to a small consultation room, the same kind of beige room where I'd signed the papers that were supposed to end a L of this. She sat down and she started speaking very carefully, enunciating each word like she was explaining something to a child or to someone who didn't speak the language. "I need to prepare you," she said. "His cognitive status is still unclear. He's responsive to stimuli, but we don't know the extent of his awareness yet. He may be experiencing things we can't measure or understand. He's still on the ventilator, because we haven't properly assessed his ability to breathe independently. His respiratory muscles have atrophied significantly after all these years. He's not going to be able to speak, not yet anyway. Maybe not ever, but we won't know until we try. When you see him, he may not recognize you. He may not recognize anyone. The brain is an incredibly complex organ, and I'm sure you know that after all this time. Traumatic injuries change the way it processes information fundamentally. They can disconnect regions that are supposed to communicate. After 19 years of minimal function, we genuinely don't know what we're going to find in there. We don't know if he's going to be your brother or a stranger wearing your brother's face." I listened to her lay out all the ways that David might not actually be David, that whatever had woken up in that bed might be a completely different person, that the brother I'd known, the person I'd been trying to let go of peacefully, might be gone forever, and what was left might be something new, something unknown, something that looked like him, but wasn't him. She was trying to prepare me, I understood that. Doctors use preparation as a shield against disappointment. But you can't really prepare yourself for something like this. You can't rehearse for the moment when the impossible becomes real. She asked me if I was ready to go in and see him. I told her I was. I wasn't sure that was true. The room looked the same as it always did. Room 412. The exact same room where I'd spent 1,000 Sunday afternoons and countless weekday evenings. I could have told you where everything was in that room with my eyes closed, walking through it completely blind. The machines clustered on the left side of the bed, various sizes and shapes beeping and humming their different songs. The monitor on the wall showing the constant stream of data, the numbers changing every moment. Heart rate, oxygen saturation, blood pressure, respiration, all of it quantified and displayed for anyone to read. The IV stands with their bags of clear fluid or medication. The feeding tube bag hanging beside the bed, the tube disappearing into his nose. The window that faced east toward the mountains in the distance. The chair where I'd sat 1,000 times, a hospital chair designed to be uncomfortable in a way that was almost intentional. The machines were the same. The bed was the same. The smell was the same. But David was different. His eyes were open. Wide open, actually, not just cracked like sometimes happened with unconscious patients. His head turned toward me when I entered. Actually turned. Physically rotated toward the sound of the door. Tracked my movement with clear intentionality. The ventilator was still in his throat, the tube secured with white tape. His body was still thin, skeletal really, still damaged by years of immobility and inactivity. But there was something behind his eyes, something present, something looking out at me. I stood in the doorway for a moment because I didn't make my legs move. The moment felt too big for my body. I was too small for whatever was happening. Then I walked to the bed and I stood there looking down at my brother and I didn't know what to say. Words seemed inadequate and also impossible. His eyes were blue, I'd forgotten that. Somehow in 19 years I'd forgotten what colour his eyes were. They were a pale blue-grey, like our mother's eyes had been. They were looking at me with something I couldn't name. Recognition, confusion, fear, accusation. All of the above? He made a sound, a strangled noise in his throat that the ventilator distorted and turned into something mechanical and wrong. Dr. Chen was standing behind me, and she explained that he was trying to speak, that his vocal cords had atrophied like everything else, that his throat muscles were weak from years of disuse, that vocalization would take time if it ever came at all. I nodded because I didn't know what else to do. I was going to cry, but I didn't. I reached out and I took his hand. The skin was papery and fragile and cold, but it was moving. I could feel the blood flowing through the veins under the skin. It was warm. It was alive. He was alive and awake and looking at me with those pale blue eyes, and I didn't know if I should be happy or terrified or guilty. I stood there holding his hand for a long time, and neither of us said anything because one of us couldn't, and the other one didn't know how. Over the next several hours, from around 6 in the morning until almost noon, David underwent what felt like an endless battery of tests. Neurological exams where they tested his reflexes and his responses. MRI scans to look at the structure of his brain. CT scans to check for any active bleeding or new damage. Blood work to measure kidney function and liver function and blood sugar and all the other things they need to measure. They tested his pupil response to light. They tested his gag reflex. They watched his movement when they moved his limbs, when they applied pressure, when they played sounds. The medical team was trying to determine how much of his brain was still functional, how much of the damage had been permanent and unchangeable, whether anything had somehow reversed itself over the years or improved through some mechanism that nobody could explain. I sat in the waiting room with a cup of coffee that tasted like burnt plastic and something chemical underneath it, and I tried not to think about the papers I'd signed just 3 days ago. I tried not to think about the relief I'd felt when I signed them. I tried not to think about the nurse coming into my apartment a week before and explaining what the palliative care plan would look like. I tried not to think about any of it. A nurse came and pulled me back into the hallway, and she told me that David was showing some motor response. Not full movement, but intentional movement. He could move his right arm slightly when they prompted him, when they told him to move it. His left side showed minimal response, barely. Perceptible, suggesting that the stroke component of his injury, the damage on the right side of his brain, was affecting his left side motor control still. His comprehension of spoken words was ambiguous, she said, which means they couldn't tell if he understood what they were saying or if he was just responding to tone or familiar voices or something else entirely. There might be some awareness of his surroundings, or it might be a reflexive reaction to stimuli, the brain responding automatically without conscious thought. They wouldn't know for sure until he could communicate more clearly. If he could communicate more clearly. That seemed to be the question hanging over everything like a weight. Could he? Would he? What was actually in that damaged brain that had been lying mostly unconscious? Just for nearly 2 decades? By the time they brought David back to his room on a gurney, all of the machines and tubes and monitoring equipment still attached, dawn was breaking over the city. Grey light, weak and pale, filtered through the hospital window. It was about 7:30 in the morning. The sun was barely up and the day was already too much. Dr. Chen sat down with me in the consultation room again, and she walked through the preliminary findings with a careful, measured voice. There was significant brain damage, she said. That hadn't changed. That was still visible on the scans. The trauma was still there, the scarring, the areas that had simply never recovered. But there was also evidence of more cortical activity than they'd seen in the previous years of monitoring. More electrical activity in different regions, more communication between different parts of the brain. She said carefully that it was possible, just possible, that some of the activity had been there all along, but they'd simply been unable to detect it with the monitoring equipment they had available, that the sensitivity of the older equipment was much less than the newer machines. It was possible, she said with significant emphasis on that word, that David had had some level of awareness the entire time, and they'd just never known it, never detected it, never been aware that he was aware. That thought made my stomach do something ugly. 19 years. 19 years of him possibly being aware, trapped inside a non-responsive body, unable to communicate with anyone, and everyone around him assuming he wasn't there. He was gone. 19 years of me talking to an empty vessel about nothing important while possibly some part of him could hear me. Possibly. She said they were going to begin physical therapy as soon as possible. Speech therapy once his throat and vocal cords had recovered a bit. Cognitive assessments to try to understand what functions he'd retained and what had been lost. They were going to try to teach his brain to work again, to bridge the damage and see what functions could be recovered or relearned or reconstructed. But it was early, she emphasized. It was very early. Outcomes were unpredictable and would remain unpredictable for weeks or months. He might recover significantly. He might regain a speech, mobility, cognition. He might plateau at some point and stay there. He might learn. There was simply no way to know. I went back into David's room and I sat in the chair next to his bed. The same chair I'd sat in so many times before. The same chair I'd sat in every Sunday for 19 years, reading to him, talking to him, telling him about my week. His eyes were closed now. His breathing was loud, mechanical, rhythmic. The ventilator doing its work, forcing air into his lungs and then releasing it. In and out. In and out. The sound of it was familiar. It was the sound of this entire chapter of my life. I studied his face and I tried to find my brother in there. I tried to see David the climber, the one who'd summited mountains, who'd stood at the top of peaks and felt genuinely alive. David, the teacher, the one who'd made physics exciting to teenage students. David, the person who'd been engaged to Lisa and was planning a future. But trauma had rewritten his features. 19 years of immobility had changed the geography of his face in ways I couldn't quite articulate. Pain and stillness and machine-assisted existence had marked him. He looked ancient and young at the same time. He looked like a stranger wearing my brother's bones. He opened his eyes after a while and he looked directly at me. There was something in that look. Something that might have been recognition, or might have been just curiosity, or might have been nothing at all. The human mind is very good at finding meaning where there might not be any. We see faces in clouds and patterns in randomness. We find what we're looking for. I reached over and I took his hand again, pressing it gently. I told him it was me. I said, Vid, it's me. It's your brother. I'm here. I told him it was going to be okay. I didn't know if either of those things were true. I didn't know if he could understand me, or if I was just making noise into a void. But I told him anyway because I needed to say something. Because after 19 years of one-sided conversation, 19 years of talking to someone who couldn't respond, I was suddenly acutely aware of how empty all those words had been. How much of a monologue. He squeezed my hand. A small pressure, barely perceptible, but it was there. It was clearly intentional. It was a response. And in that moment I understood that everything had changed. Again. The ending I'd written wasn't the ending anymore. The decision I'd made had been rendered meaningless by the simple biological FA, CT of consciousness returning. I had no idea what came next. I had no idea how to process this. All I knew was that my brother had squeezed my hand, and that simple gesture contained all the complexity and confusion and hope and terror that I couldn't put into words. Over the next week I found myself doing something I hadn't done in 19 years. I was asking David questions about his memories. Stupid questions at first, yes or no questions, because that's all he could answer with slight head movements or squeezes of his hand. Do you remember Mom? 1 squeeze. Do you remember Lisa? 2 squeezes, which I interpreted as confusion or pain or something I couldn't articulate. Do you remember falling? And he just lay there with his eyes closed, his breathing mechanical and regular, and I didn't know if that silence meant he didn't remember, or if it meant he remembered everything, and the memory was too much to process or communicate. The nurse was rotating him regularly to prevent bed sores, a procedure that looked agonizing even though I was told he couldn't. It'd feel much below his neck. They'd get him onto his side every 2 hours, his body going rigid and stiff from years of minimal movement, his muscles protesting the motion, even though there was no conscious sensation to accompany the protest. I sat through these rotations every day that I could get to the hospital, which was most days, actually all days, because I couldn't seem to stay away. Work had become impossible. I kept trying. I'd sit at my desk and pretend to work, but I was really scrolling through my phone, reading about traumatic brain injuries and consciousness, and the different levels of awareness, and whether someone could remember things while unconscious, and whether memories formed during periods of altered consciousness were real memories or false memories or something in between. I read about neuroplasticity and the brain's ability to rewire itself after damage. I read about locked-in syndrome, where people are conscious but completely unable to communicate, trapped inside their own bodies. I read about minimally conscious states, and how they're different from vegetative states, and how hard it is to tell the difference. I read about the Glasgow Coma scale and what different scores meant and how it was used to predict outcomes. I read about secondary brain injury and how sometimes the original trauma wasn't the worst part, it was what happened afterward. The cascade of cellular damage and inflammation that continued for hours and days and weeks after the initial event. I read about comas lasting decades and people waking up when nobody expected them to in IRA. Read about comas lasting forever and people never waking up at all. I read medical papers I barely understood, filled with terminology and statistics and case studies, searching for some precedent for what was happening to David, searching for evidence that this had happened before to someone else, that I wasn't in completely uncharted territory. I joined online support groups for people with brain injuries and people with family members in prolonged comas and people trying to navigate the medical system, and I read their stories of hope and despair, of miraculous recoveries and heartbreaking declines, and I didn't know which story was David's story. Dr. Chen kept emphasizing that they didn't know. That was her favorite phrase. We don't know yet. We don't know how extensive the recovery will be. We don't know if he'll regain speech. We don't know if his cognition will return to anywhere near normal. We don't know. They were running more sophisticated brain scans now, the kind that could measure activity in individual regions, that could show which parts of his brain were lighting up and talking to which other parts. They were sending him to speech therapy even though he couldn't speak. The therapist working with the muscles in his throat and teaching him swallowing exercises, tiny physiological interventions designed to rebuild the infrastructure of vocalization. They were starting physical therapy, movements of his limbs, passive exercises designed to maintain whatever muscle mass hadn't already atrophied and to encourage whatever recovery might be possible. They were playing, you hear music, because someone had read somewhere that music might stimulate memory or emotional response or something unmeasurable in the brain. They were giving him every possible intervention they could think of because nobody actually knew what would work. It was trial and error on a human being. It was my brother as an experiment. And I was allowing it because what else could I do? The alternative was giving up. The alternative was writing a different ending than the one we were now living. I think it was on day 10 when Dr. Chen sat me down and said something that changed how I understood the entire preceding 19 years. She had something to show me. She opened a patient file on her computer and pulled up his scans, the brain imaging from the previous year, the one that had been taken during his regular checkups when I was signing papers to let him die. The images were confusing at first, just coloured regions on a dark background, but she pointed out the areas that mattered. She pointed to a region, something about the thalamus, something technical that I didn't fully understand but grasped the general concept of. The thalamus is like the relay station of the brain, she explained. It's one of the primary switches for consciousness. There was activity here, she said, and she traced her finger across the screen. Significant activity. Activity that indicated some level of awareness, some level of processing, some level of consciousness. Not the kind of activity you'd see in a fully conscious, fully awake person, but more than you'd see in someone completely unconscious. And then she pulled up the scans from now, from the past week after he'd regained consciousness. The activity was different, but not wildly different. It wasn't like a switch had flipped from off to on. It was more like the volume had been turned up on something that was already there. And so, either that means, she said carefully, that David has been aware on some level this entire time and we simply didn't have the tools to detect it, or it means that his brain was already attempting to recove there and we weren't seeing it because we weren't looking in the right way or at the right resolution. Either way, she said, it suggests that consciousness might not have been completely absent these past 19 years. He might have been in there, buried, trapped, experiencing something even though he couldn't communicate it. The room started spinning a little bit. 19 years. 19 years of him possibly aware. 19 years of me talking at him about nothing important, narrating my life while he potentially experienced something like imprisonment, like being buried alive in his own body. She was watching my face and I could see the calculation happening in her eyes, the doctor trying to gauge whether this information was helpful or devastating. Honestly, she said, we'll probably know for certain. The brain's capacity for awareness varies wildly from person to person, and we don't have the language to measure subjective experience. He might have been aware of his surroundings and people around him. He might have been trapped in a nightmare of his own making, a loop of dream or memory or fragmented consciousness. He might have experienced time differently, minutes feeling like hours or years collapsing into moments. He might have been experiencing nothing at all, just electrical activity without subjective experience, the brain maintaining basic functions without consciousness accompanying it. But he was in there, she said. The data suggests strongly that he was in there somewhere. So then I had to sit with that, had to process that in addition to processing everything else, had to understand that when I signed those papers, when I decided to stop intervention and allow natural death to occur, I might have been making that decision about someone who was aware, someone who was trapped and possibly terrified and possibly had been trapped and terrified for 19 years, someone whose consciousness I might have been ending. I couldn't breathe for a while after that realization. I stood in the hospital hallway and I couldn't breathe, and a nurse asked if I was okay, and I lied and said yes, and then went to the bathroom and sat on the floor for 20 minutes with my head in my hands. I called Catherine, actually got up the courage to call her for the first time in 2 years. I left her a voicemail, my voice shaking, trying to explain that I needed to talk to her, that something had happened, that I'd made a mistake, that I needed someone to tell me I'd made a mistake. She called me back within an hour. She listened while I explained what Dr. Chen had told me, and there was a long silence on the other end of the line, the kind of silence that stretches out and becomes a presence in itself. "You couldn't have known," she said finally. "You made the best decision you could with the information you had." "But the information was wrong," I said. "We had the wrong information. We've always had the wrong information." "You don't know that for sure," she said, and her voice was careful, the voice of someone trying to talk down a person on a ledge. "You don't know what he was experiencing. You don't know if he was suffering. You made a compassionate choice based on what you knew and what you believed was best for him. And that's not something you need to feel guilty about." But I did feel guilty. That was the whole point. I felt guilty regardless of what the information said or didn't say, because I had signed papers to end his life, and then he had somehow defied those papers by waking up. Because I had already given him up, and then he had come back, and that felt like a punishment or a lesson or some kind of cosmic correction that said I wasn't allowed to let go. David's first word came on day 15. Not a word, technically, more like a sound that approximated a word. The speech therapist was working with him, doing these exercises with his tongue and his lips, trying to teach the muscles to move in ways they hadn't moved in 19 years. He was making all these little sounds, consonants and vowels, the building blocks of speech, and then suddenly there was something more intentional. My. Not complete. The second syllable cut off by the mechanics of his weakened throat, but it was my. Mike, what? I was in the room when it happened and I froze. My. He said my. And then he looked at me with those pale blue eyes, and there was definitely something in them. Recognition, or intention, or just focus. Something. My, he said again, and then something that might have been a name, but wasn't quite coherent. I called the nurse and the speech therapist and Dr. Chen, all of them rushing in to witness this miracle or catastrophe, depending on your perspective, this return of linguistic capacity that nobody had expected this quickly. They were all excited, all making notes, all talking about neural plasticity and recovery trajectories, and the possibility that his brain was more resilient than they'd anticipated. But all I could focus on was his eyes on my face. My, he was saying, and I understood that he was trying to tell me something, not just demonstrating vocal capacity. He was trying to tell me something. I leaned close and I said, "David, what are you trying to say? Say my name. Say whatever you want to say. My." He kept saying it. My, a. And then finally a thin sound that might have been fault. My fault. My fault. My fault. He was saying my fault, and I didn't know what that meant. I didn't know what he thought was his fault, because if anything was fault, it was mine. It was my fault for not being able to save him, for not being able to bring him all the way back, for signing those papers that were supposed to end him. But he kept saying my fault, and I realized that maybe he was trapped in a single thought. Maybe his damaged brain could only generate these syllables over and over. Maybe he was trying to say something completely different, and my brain was imposing meaning onto disconnected sounds. The therapist said they needed to go slowly with recovery, that he'd need rest, that the effort of vocalization was exhausting for him, that they couldn't push too hard or risk overwhelming his system. So they sedated him gently and he faded, and I sat there in that plastic chair thinking about those 4 syllables. My fault. Whose fault was it? David's for the climbing accident that happened 19 years ago. Mine for surviving when he didn't. both of us for whatever inexplicable medical phenomenon had changed everything. Catherine came to the hospital the next day. I hadn't asked her to come. She just showed up carrying 2 coffees and that expression she got whenever something was monumentally wrong, and she was trying to hold it together. She sat down next to me in the waiting room and she didn't say anything for a long time. Finally she said, "I remember after the accident, you couldn't stop blaming yourself. You kept saying you should have been there. You should have checked the equipment with him. You should have seen this coming. And I told you then, just like I'm telling you now, that you can't make decisions for other people. You can't live his life for him or prevent every bad thing that might happen. You're human. You're not God. You can't save everyone." "I know that," I said. "I know all of that intellectually. And yet I was going to let him die anyway." "That's not the same thing," she said. "That was compassion. That was mercy. That was you making an impossible choice because continuing on the way things were seemed crueler than letting go." "You didn't do anything wrong." "The universe didn't agree," I said. "The universe woke him up to prove me wrong." "The universe doesn't prove anything," Catherine said firmly. "The universe just happens. Things occur. Physics works in ways we don't always understand. Your guilt isn't cosmic. It's just human. It's just you being hard on yourself because you're a person who feels things deeply and carries them for a long time." She reached over and took my hand, and it was so familiar, such a gesture from our years together before everything broke, that I almost, Saint cried. "I'm sorry," I said. "For what?" "For everything. For being a terrible husband, for not being present, for letting our family fracture, for not being able to fix David, for not being strong enough to bear this weight." Catherine looked at me with an expression I couldn't read. "You don't have to be strong," she said. "You just have to be human, and you're allowed to struggle with that. You're allowed to feel terrible about terrible things. That doesn't make you a bad person. It makes you a person who cares, and maybe that's been your problem this whole time. You care too much. You carry too much. You blame yourself for things that aren't your responsibility to fix." Over the following weeks, David's recovery plateaued in some ways and accelerated in others. His speech improved incrementally, moving from single words and fragmentary sentences to more complex thoughts, though they were always effortful, always costly in terms of energy and focus. The effort would leave him exhausted, needing hours of sleep to recover from the expenditure. His physical therapy showed incremental gains in motor control, his right arm gaining more purposeful movement, his left side remaining mostly unresponsive, the stroke component of his injury proving more resistant to recovery than the brain trauma. He could move his right hand to his face now, could grasp objects with his right hand, though the control was crude and imprecise, like watching someone learn to use their limbs for the first time. His cognitive functioning remained uncertain and unmeasurable. He seemed to recognize me, but I couldn't be sure if he was recognizing me as his brother, or if he was recognizing me as the person who visited regularly and represented some baseline of familiarity in his confused, damaged existence. Sometimes he'd call me by other names of people from his past, old friends or former colleagues, and I'd gently correct him, and he'd seem confused, and then the moment would pass and he'd be back in the present, wherever that was for him. The hospital eventually moved him to an inpatient rehabilitation facility, a different building attached to the main hospital, designed for the long-term recovery process that he was going to need. They had specialized therapists, here, occupational therapists and neuropsychologists and physical medicine experts. They had structured programming, they had groups and interventions and all the infrastructure designed to support someone returning to consciousness after 19 years. I kept going. Every day I drove to the facility and I sat in his room and we did whatever activity the therapist had prescribed. Physical therapy, where I helped him move his limbs through specific ranges of motion. Speech practice, where I read to him, and he tried to follow along, his comprehension seeming to improve daily, though sometimes he'd lose the thread and I'd have to backtrack and start again. Cognitive exercises, where they'd show him pictures or play him sounds and he'd have to identify them, his accuracy improving in some categories and remaining constant in others. It became my life, this rehabilitation, this daily negotiation with recovery and limitation, and the terrible mystery of what my brother was actually experiencing on the inside of his damaged brain. Sophie came to visit once, a few weeks into his recovery. She sat very still in the chair and she looked at David for a long time and then she looked at me. "He doesn't remember me at all, does he?" "I don't think so," I said. "I think he has some memory of the time before the accident. But everything after that is probably fragmented or gone or something we can't measure." She nodded and she said, "I'm angry at you." "I know," I said. "I deserve that. I'm angry that you tried to let him go without consulting me. I'm angry that you made decisions about his life without giving me a chance to have a say in them. I'm angry that you were prepared to accept a world without him in it, at least in a meaningful way. And I'm angry that he woke up, and I don't know if that makes the anger more valid or less valid or just different." She started crying and I moved to comfort her, but she held up a hand. "I'm not done. I'm also grateful," she said. "I'm grateful that he's here. I'm grateful that whatever inexplicable thing happened, happened. I'm grateful that I still have a brother, even if he's different than the brother I remembered, even if he might never be the same as he was. So I'm angry and grateful simultaneously, and I don't know how to reconcile those two feelings, and that's something I'm going to have to work on in therapy." "That's fair," I said. "That's more fair than I deserve." She spent the afternoon with us, reading to David from a physics journal, his field, a connection to the person he'd been before his brain had been rearranged by trauma and time. His eyes tracked the words, and sometimes he smiled, and I could see something in there, some vestige of the person he'd been, the teacher who'd made physics accessible and exciting to teenagers, the climber who'd stood on mountain peaks and felt genuinely alive. He was still in there somewhere, underneath the damage, under the confusion and the disability and the recovery that might never be complete. Eventually, David would move to an outpatient rehabilitation program. Eventually, some new version of normal would establish itself. Eventually, we might know more about what happened to him, or we might never know. We might just have to accept the mystery and move on. But for now, we existed in this space between his old life and whatever new life was being constructed for him. Moment by moment, cell by cell, neural pathway by neural pathway, the brain slowly recalibrating itself after nearly 2 decades of dormancy. I made the decision to quit my job. I called my supervisor, and I told him that I needed to focus on my family, that my brother needed support that I couldn't provide if I was working full-time, that my priorities had fundamentally shifted and I couldn't pretend they hadn't. They weren't happy about it, but they accepted it, and I felt a weight lift that I didn't know was sitting on my chest until it was gone. Catherine helped me work through the logistics of separity, on from employment, helped me understand health insurance and disability benefits, and all the bureaucratic machinery that surrounds these kinds of decisions, and we talked about the possibility of going back to school, of doing something different with my life. Maybe something in medicine, she suggested. Maybe something in therapy or support work, something that would let me channel this experience into helping other people navigate similar crises, similar impossible decisions, similar waves of guilt and regret and hope all tangled together. "I don't know," I said. "I don't know what comes next. I don't know if I have it in me to do that." And she said, "Maybe that's okay. Maybe you don't need to know everything right now. Maybe you just need to focus on being present with your brother and let whatever comes next come when it's ready." That's what I'm trying to do. That's what I do now, day after day. I wake up and I drive to the rehabilitation facility, and I sit with David, and I help him recover piece by piece from the injury that nearly ended him, and the coma that held him for 19 years, and the decision I made to let him go that somehow got reversed by the universe, or by chance, or by whatever name we want to give to things that happen that we can't explain. He still can't tell me what his experience was, whether those 19 years were an unconscious void or a nightmare or something else entirely. He probably can't tell me because his damaged brain doesn't have the capacity to access or articulate whatever he experienced, or maybe he just doesn't have the words for DS, something so far outside normal human experience. But sometimes, when we're sitting quietly together, when there are no therapists running tests or machines making noise, or nurses checking vitals, he'll squeeze my hand and I'll squeeze back, and that tiny gesture will contain all the complexity of our relationship, all the guilt and love and survival and grace and terror that binds us together as brothers, and it will be enough for a moment. It will be more than enough. It will be everything. I stopped trying to make sense of what happened. I stopped trying to determine whether it was a miracle or a medical anomaly or just chance. I stopped trying to calculate probability and understand the improbable. I just show up and I hold his hand and I sit in a chair beside his bed and I let the universe be incomprehensible. That has to be enough. It has to be.